It was finally ours. After years of saving, my husband Mark and I had bought our first home. It was an old house, but it had character. The large wooden beams in the ceiling, the wide stone fireplace in the living room, and the creaky wooden floors all gave it a charm that newer homes couldn't match. The house sat on a few acres of land, surrounded by trees, with no neighbors in sight. It was peaceful. We moved in during the fall, just as the leaves were beginning to turn yellow and red. The first few days were spent unpacking boxes and getting settled. Everything seemed perfect. But then strange things began to happen. It started with small noises, things we could easily explain away. At night, while we were lying in bed, we'd hear creaking sounds coming from the floors downstairs. "It's just the house settling," Mark would say. And I believed him. Old houses creak after all. But then, one night, I woke up to a sound that I couldn't explain away. It was a whisper, faint and almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The whispering continued, coming from the hallway just outside our bedroom door. It sounded like someone was quietly talking, but I couldn't make out any words. "Mark," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned and rolled over, half asleep. "It's nothing, go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the soft murmurs until they finally faded away. The next morning, I mentioned the whispering to Mark over breakfast. He shrugged it off. "You were probably just dreaming," he said. But I knew I hadn't been. A few days later, we were in the living room, watching TV, when we heard a loud bang from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen over. Mark jumped up and ran upstairs to check, but everything was exactly as we had left it. Nothing had moved. "Maybe it was the wind," Mark suggested, though he didn't seem convinced. After that, things escalated quickly. At night, I began to hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth across the hallway. Mark heard them too, but he refused to admit that something was wrong. "It's just an old house," he kept saying, but I knew better. There was something in that house, something that didn't want us there. I was alone in the kitchen, making dinner, when I felt it, a cold, icy breath on the back of my neck. I froze, too scared to turn around. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and my heart raced. I could feel someone standing behind me, even though I knew no one was there. Slowly, I turned around, but there was nothing, just an empty kitchen. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I felt it all the time now, like someone was always right behind me, watching, waiting. One night, I had a nightmare. In the dream, I was lying in bed when I felt something cold and heavy press down on my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I looked up and saw a dark figure standing over me, its face hidden in shadow. It leaned down close to my ear and whispered something I couldn't understand. I woke up screaming. Mark tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. He was finally starting to believe that something was wrong with the house. The next day, we called a priest to bless the house, hoping that it would put an end to whatever was haunting us. The priest came and walked through every room, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers. For a few days, everything seemed better. The house was quiet, and I began to think that maybe it had all been in my head. But then, late one night, the whispering returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. The whispers seemed to come from every direction surrounding me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed Mark and told him we had to leave right then and there. He didn't argue. We packed a few bags and drove to a nearby motel, leaving everything else behind. The next day, we called a real estate agent and put the house up for sale. We never went back. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't something we could fight. It was angry, and it wanted us gone. We were more than happy to leave. Months later, the house finally sold. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt as I handed over the keys to the new owners. I wanted to warn them, to tell them to be careful, but I didn't. What would I say? That the house was haunted? They wouldn't believe. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the old house one last time. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching us leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. I shook my head and turned away, hoping that whoever moved in next would have better luck than we did. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some houses just don't want to be lived in. and ours was one of them. When we first moved into the house on Willow Road, I thought it was perfect. It was an old 2-story house with a big front porch and a large yard. The neighborhood was quiet, and the house itself seemed cozy. My husband Tom and I were excited to start a new chapter in our lives there. But from the very first night, something felt off. The house was always cold, no matter how high we set the thermostat. I tried to brush it off as just an old house issue, drafty windows or poor insulation. Tom agreed and said we could get it checked out, but something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me. Then one evening, as I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen, I heard it. A soft knock coming from the front door. I froze for a moment, listening. It was strange because it was already late, and we weren't expecting anyone. I walked over to the door and opened it, but no one was there. I stepped outside, looking up and down the empty street, but it was quiet, with not a soul in sight. I went back inside, telling myself it must have been the wind or maybe a branch tapping against the house. A few days later it happened again, another knock, this time louder. Tom was home with me, and he heard it too. We both went to the door, but again, no one was there. It was strange, but we tried to laugh it off. "Maybe it's just the house settling," Tom said, trying to calm my nerves. But the knocks continued, growing more frequent. And then, things got worse. One night, after Tom had already gone to bed, I stayed up late reading in the living room. The house was quiet, and I was just about to turn off the lights when I heard footsteps upstairs. They were slow, heavy, and deliberate. My heart began to race as I sat frozen in my chair, listening. I knew Tom was asleep and there was no one else in the house. I slowly got up and crept to the bottom of the stairs, trying to see if I could catch a glimpse of anything. The footsteps stopped suddenly, as if whoever or whatever it was knew I was listening. I called out, "Tom?" But there was no answer. The only sound was my own breathing, loud in the silence. I took a deep breath and forced myself to go upstairs. When I reached our bedroom, I found Tom sound asleep, undisturbed. The next morning, I told Tom what had happened. He looked concerned but tried to stay calm. "Maybe we should get someone to check the house," he suggested. But I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. We called a contractor to inspect the house, but he found nothing wrong. No loose floorboards, no signs of animals, nothing that could explain the noises. After that, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Knocking on the walls, footsteps at all hours, and the feeling that we were never truly alone. The worst part was the whispers. Late at night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I would hear them, soft voices, too quiet to understand, but always there, just on the edge of hearing. I would lie in bed, terrified to move, listening as the whispers grew louder, then faded away, only to return the next night. Tom heard them too, but we never talked about it. We both knew something was wrong with the house, but we didn't know how to fix it. One night I woke up to find Tom sitting at the edge of the bed, staring out the window. His face was pale, and he looked lost in thought. "Tom, are you okay?" I asked, reaching out to touch his shoulder. He turned to me slowly, his eyes wide with fear. "I saw something outside," he whispered. "It was standing in the yard, just watching us." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't dare look out the window. Instead, I grabbed Tom's hand and pulled him back into bed. We held each other tightly, neither of us saying a word. The next morning, we made the decision to leave. We packed up our things as quickly as we could and left Willow Road behind us, leaving the house empty once more. I don't know what was in that house, but I do know that it didn't want us there. And as we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the house one last time. In the upstairs window, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching us go. But when I blinked, it was gone. We never went back to Willow Road. Some houses are just not meant to be lived in. When we bought the house on Pine Hill, it felt like a dream come true. It was an old farmhouse, nestled on a quiet road, surrounded by trees. The kind of place you imagine raising a family. My wife Emily and I couldn't wait to settle in and start our new life together. From the outside, the house looked perfect. It had a big front porch, a huge yard, and a charming old barn out back. But as soon as we moved in, things didn't feel quite right. The house had a strange atmosphere, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. On our first night, after we had unpacked some boxes, we were sitting in the living room when we heard it, a loud bang from upstairs. It sounded like something had fallen over. Emily and I exchanged glances. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, trying to stay calm. "I'll go check." I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the top, I noticed that the door to the guest bedroom was open. I could have sworn we had closed it earlier. I stepped inside the room, but everything seemed normal. Nothing had fallen over, and nothing was out of place. I closed the door again and went back downstairs, telling Emily that it must have been the house settling. But the noises continued. Every night we would hear footsteps creaking across the floor above us, doors opening and closing on their own, and the occasional soft thud, like something or someone was moving around in the house. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like a distant conversation, but I couldn't make out any words. I lay there in bed, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I turned to Emily to ask if she could hear it too, but she was sound asleep. The next morning I mentioned the whispers to her. She looked at me with concern. "I've been hearing them too," she admitted. "I didn't want to scare you, but I've been hearing voices at night, like people talking." From that moment on, we both knew something was wrong with the house. The feeling of being watched became stronger, and the strange noises grew louder. We would find things in the house move to different places, objects we hadn't touched. Doors would slam shut on their own, and sometimes we'd come home to find the front door wide open, even though we were sure we had locked it. One evening, I was alone in the kitchen when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved quickly past the window, but when I looked outside, there was no one there. My heart raced as I quickly closed the curtains, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that someone or something was watching me. That night, Emily and I were lying in bed when we both heard it, a low, deep voice coming from the hallway. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, and it sounded angry. We held each other, too terrified to move, as the voice grew louder, and then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. We knew then that we couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever was haunting Pine Hill didn't want us there. The next day, we packed our bags and left, leaving everything behind. We didn't care about the furniture or the boxes still unpacked. We just wanted to get out. We never went back to the house on Pine Hill. We heard later that no one stayed there for long. People would move in, and within a few months they'd leave, just like we did. Some places are cursed, I think. And that house, no matter how perfect it seemed, was one of them.